Good morning from the ridges of Gibson County. Behind me is the Gibson family homestead, a patch of mountain hollow where in March of '78, 16 federal agents walked in to serve warrants.
Between March 3rd and March 24th, 1887, 16 United States Marshals disappeared across a 70-mile stretch of eastern Tennessee mountains, vanishing from their pursuit operations, their campsites, their temporary command posts established to coordinate manhunt for the Gibson Brothers who'd killed 3 marshals during botched raid on family homestead in Carter County where federal authorities believed the family was harboring Confederate guerrillas wanted for bank robbery. By March 28th, all 16 were dead. Their bodies discovered in locations deliberately chosen to mark routes they'd traveled during initial raid and subsequent pursuit operations that had transformed from law enforcement action into systematic war between federal authority and mountain family that refused to surrender, members accused of crimes they insisted they hadn't committed. The perpetrators were the 7 Gibson brothers: Samuel, William, Thomas, Robert, James, Daniel, and youngest Matthew, age 17, who'd watched United States Marshals kill their father and wound their mother during raid that had been based on false intelligence from informants seeking reward money, who'd spent 3 weeks hunting federal agents through mountains they'd known since childhood, demonstrating that badges provided no protection against determined men defending family honor and homestead sovereignty. The Justice Department would classify it as the deadliest attack on federal marshals in post-Civil War era, exceeding losses during Reconstruction violence throughout South. But motive wasn't anti-government extremism or criminal conspiracy protecting outlaws. It was 7 brothers delivering justice for father's murder and mother's injury, proving that federal authority ended where mountain families' willingness to defend their own began. That warrants and badges meant nothing when enforcement required entering territories where populations supported resistors over federal agents implementing laws communities rejected. If you're ready to hear how false accusation and botched raid triggered bloodiest manhunt in Tennessee mountain history, hit that subscribe button. But understand, this story contains dramatized account of systematic violence against federal law enforcement during post-Reconstruction era. Carter County, Tennessee occupied 340 square miles of Appalachian Mountain territory in 1887, wedged between Virginia and North Carolina borders, populated by 18,000 people, mostly descended from Scots-Irish settlers who'd arrived before Revolutionary War and maintained independent mountain culture that barely acknowledged federal authority 22 years. After Civil War had nominally reunited nation, the county's seat, Elizabethton, held 2,000 residents around courthouse representing government authority that functioned primarily for recording land deeds and marriages, rarely for enforcing federal laws that mountain communities viewed as distant abstractions unrelated to their lives. March 1887 meant temperatures in 40s during day, dropping below freezing at night. Last snow of winter, still covering north-facing slopes above 4,000 feet. Mountain streams running high with melt that made fording dangerous and limited access to isolated homesteads accessible only by trails that became impassable during heavy weather. The Gibson family had settled in Carter County in 1792, claimed 300 acres in remote valley accessible by single wagon trail that climbed through gap requiring 2 hours from nearest settlement. Established homestead that had housed 5 generations over 95 years. Samuel Gibson Sr. was born in 1821. Had been 44 when Civil War began. Too old for Confederate conscription but sympathetic to Southern cause. Had sheltered deserters from both armies who'd fled through mountains avoiding authorities. His wife Martha, 49 in 1887, had raised 7 sons and 3 daughters on Homestead, where family grew corn and tobacco, raised livestock, hunted deer and wild turkey, lived largely self-sufficient existence that required minimal interaction with outside world and generated suspicion among federal authorities who viewed isolated mountain families as likely harboring criminals or resisting. Reconstruction policies. The 7 Gibson brothers range from Samuel Jr. age 32 down to Matthew age 17, all raised on homestead learning, hunting, and tracking and mountain survival skills that made them formidable in terrain that disadvantaged outsiders unfamiliar with landscape. Samuel Jr. had fought for Confederacy, had been captured at Shiloh and spent 2 years in Union prison camp, had returned home in 1865 bitter about federal government that had imprisoned him and imposed Reconstruction policies he viewed as punishment for defending homeland. His younger brothers had been too young for war but had absorbed his attitudes, understood federal authority as occupying force rather than legitimate government, viewed marshals and revenue agents as enemies rather than law enforcement deserving cooperation or respect. The trouble began. February 15th, 1887, when bank in nearby Jonesboro was robbed by 4 masked men who escaped with $8,000, killing bank president during escape when he'd attempted to raise alarm. Witnesses described robbers as rough men speaking with mountain accents, suggested they'd fled toward Carter County mountains where numerous isolated homesteads could shelter fugitives. Federal authorities assigned United States Marshal Thomas Crawford to investigate, authorized him to form posse and pursue robbers into mountain territory where local sheriffs had minimal authority and populations often protected outlaws against federal law enforcement. Crawford was 41 years old, had served as Union officer during war, understood Appalachian resistance to federal authority but believed aggressive enforcement would demonstrate that post-war government wouldn't tolerate criminal violence regardless of where perpetrators hid. Crawford's investigation identified 4 suspects, former Confederate guerrillas named Clayton Miller, Harris, and Walsh, who'd operated together during war, and were known to associate with families throughout Carter County mountains who'd supported Southern cause. Witnesses claimed to have seen men matching their descriptions near Gibson Homestead week before robbery, suggested Gibson family might be harboring the fugitives or knew their whereabouts. The information came from an informant named Jacob Morrison, local man with grudge against Gibson family over disputed land boundary, who told Crawford that Gibson brothers were hiding the robbers and would resist arrest violently if federal authorities attempted raid on their homestead. Crawford assembled posse of 19 marshals in early March, experienced officers who'd conducted enforcement operations throughout Tennessee during Reconstruction, men accustomed to resistance from mountain families who viewed federal authority as illegitimate. He planned dawn raid on Gibson Homestead for March 3rd, intended to surround property and demand surrender of anyone harboring fugitives, prepared for potential violence but believing overwhelming force would prevent bloodshed by demonstrating futility of resistance. Crawford had consulted with Justice Department, received authorization to use necessary force if Gibson family refused cooperation, understood his raid represented federal government's determination to pursue bank robbers regardless of mountain communities' traditional protection of outlaws. The raid began at 5:30 morning of March 3rd, 19 marshals surrounding Gibson Homestead in darkness, positioning themselves to cover all exits from main cabin and outbuildings where family lived and worked. Crawford called out at dawn demanding Samuel Gibson Sr. surrender any fugitives harbored on property, threatened to arrest entire family for harboring criminals if cooperation wasn't immediate. Samuel Sr. emerged from cabin unarmed, denied harboring anyone, invited Crawford to search property but warned that aggressive entry without cause would be resisted as trespass on family land. Crawford interpreted the warning as admission of guilt, ordered marshals to advance and conduct forcible search of all structures. The confrontation escalated within minutes. Deputy Marshal Robert Hayes kicked in cabin door while family was eating breakfast, pointed rifle at Martha Gibson, demanding she reveal where fugitives were hiding. Samuel Sr. rushed from outside to protect his wife, was shot twice by Hayes, who claimed he'd feared attack despite Samuel being unarmed and attempting only to shield Martha from Marshall, who'd burst into their home. Martha screamed and lunged at Hayes, was struck in head with rifle butt by another marshal named William Bradford, who'd followed Hayes through door. The violence triggered response from Samuel Jr. and his brothers, who'd been in barn when raid began, had armed themselves when hearing mother scream. Emerged to find father shot and bleeding while mother lay unconscious, and marshals were ransacking their home searching for fugitives who weren't present. Samuel Jr. shot Deputy Hayes through window, killed him instantly with rifle shot to head. William Gibson shot Marshal Bradford, wounded him severely before 3rd Marshal returned fire and drove brothers back into defensive positions around barn. The gunfight lasted approximately 20 minutes, ended when Crawford ordered withdrawal, recognizing his intelligence had been wrong. No fugitives were present. Raid had become disaster, killing 1 marshal and wounding 2 others, including Bradford, who died during transport back to Elizabethton. Crawford left, carrying his casualties, promised Samuel Jr. that federal arrest warrants would be issued for entire Gibson family for murdering Deputy Hayes, that additional marshals would return to arrest everyone present regardless of how forcefully they'd been provoked by illegal raid based on false information. Samuel Gibson Sr. died March 4th from wounds suffered during raid, never regaining consciousness after being shot by Deputy Hayes, who'd burst into family home without cause and had killed innocent man defending his wife from armed intruder. Martha Gibson survived head wound but suffered permanent damage, affecting balance and vision, would never fully recover from injury inflicted by Marshall, who'd struck elderly woman for protesting violent intrusion into her home. The family buried Samuel Sr. on Homestead, where he'd lived 66 years. Understood that federal government's response to botched raid would be escalated enforcement rather than acknowledgement. That Crawford's operation had been based on false intelligence from informant with personal grudge against Gibson family. Federal warrants were issued March 6 for all 7 Gibson brothers, charging them with murder of Deputy Marshal Robert Hayes, harboring fugitives, though no evidence supported that charge, and resisting federal officers during lawful search, despite search having been based on demonstrably false information. The warrants authorized marshals to use deadly force if brothers resisted arrest, classified them as dangerous fugitives who'd killed federal officer and would likely kill again if given opportunity. Justice Department assigned additional 16 marshals to Tennessee operation, ordered them to coordinate with Crawford's surviving posse members, authorized creation of special task force that would operate until all Gibson brothers were captured or killed. An example had been made that murdering federal marshals resulted in overwhelming retaliation regardless of circumstances that had triggered original violence. The Gibson brothers understood that surrendering meant execution or life imprisonment for defending family against illegal raid, that federal authorities wouldn't acknowledge Crawford's mistakes or Hayes's unprovoked killing of their father. They gathered at Homestead March 7th with extended family and neighbors, discussed whether to flee to other states or remain in mountains they'd known all their lives. Their mother, Martha, despite her injuries, insisted they'd done nothing wrong, that defending home against violent intruders was righteous regardless of badges worn by men who'd killed husband and injured her. She told her sons that federal government had declared war on their family through illegal raid based on lies, that running meant surrendering their heritage and accepting guilt for defending themselves and their parents. The brothers decided to remain in Carter County, defend their territory using knowledge of mountains that gave them advantages over marshals unfamiliar with terrain. But they also decided that defensive posture wasn't sufficient, that allowing federal authorities to hunt them without cost would encourage continued aggression. Samuel Jr. proposed systematic elimination of every marshal participating in manhunt, argued that making enforcement operations so costly in federal lives would force Justice Department to withdraw from Carter County and abandon pursuit of family that had been wrongly accused and illegally raided. His brothers agreed immediately, understood they were committing to warfare against United States government, accepted the consequences would be severe, but believed defending family honor required, demonstrating that killing innocent mountain man and injuring his elderly wife would cost federal authorities more than they were willing to pay. 23 marshals were operating in Carter County by March 10th, Crawford surviving, 17 plus 6 additional officers sent from Virginia and North Carolina to support manhunt. They established command posts in Elizabethton, coordinated patrols through mountain territory where Gibson Brothers were believed hiding, interviewed residents who mostly refused cooperation because they viewed federal raid as illegal violence against innocent family. The marshals operated in groups of 3 or 4, believed numbers provided security against ambush, didn't understand that Gibson Brothers' knowledge of terrain meant group size was irrelevant when attackers could position themselves at distances where return fire was ineffective. The systematic elimination began March 12th when 3 marshals patrolling trail toward Gibson Homestead were shot from concealed positions on ridgeline 800 yards above trail. All 3 died instantly, killed by skilled marksmen using hunting rifles. Bodies found by subsequent patrol that evening. Crawford understood immediately this was beginning of coordinated campaign rather than isolated defensive action. The Gibson brothers had decided to hunt their hunters, requested additional 20 marshals from Justice Department to replace casualties and provide sufficient numbers to conduct operations despite losses. Justice Department approved requests, but warned Crawford that public opinion was turning against federal authorities whose botched raid based on false intelligence had killed innocent man and triggered violence that was now costing federal officers their lives. Additional marshals died March 14th. 2 officers ambushed while scouting potential Gibson hideout in remote Hollow. March 16th brought 3 more casualties when patrol was caught in Narrow Valley where Gibson Brothers had positioned themselves on surrounding ridges. Systematic crossfire that eliminated marshals before they could retreat or find cover. The pattern continued through mid-March, 1 or 2 marshals dying every 2 days. Systematic elimination that demonstrated Gibson Brothers could strike anywhere in Carter County territory without being caught or killed themselves, despite federal authorities' numerical superiority and official authority. Crawford's morale deteriorated as casualties mounted, surviving marshals increasingly reluctant to patrol areas where ambushes were likely, understanding they were hunting 7 men who knew every ridge and hollow and trail, who had community support that meant federal authorities received no intelligence about Gibson movements or positions. By March 20th, 11 marshals were dead. Crawford had received authorization to deploy federal troops, but military commanders refused to commit soldiers to operation that appeared to be unwinnable. Manhunt in hostile territory where civilian population supported fugitives over government forces. Crawford's own deputies began discussing whether continuing operation was worth additional lives, whether withdrawing from Carter County and allowing Gibson Brothers to remain unprosecuted was pragmatic recognition that some populations couldn't be controlled through aggressive enforcement in terrain that favored defenders. The decisive engagement came March 22nd when Crawford led 8-man patrol attempting to locate Gibson family's support network, interviewed residents who he believed were supplying fugitives with food and ammunition. The patrol was ambushed at dusk while returning to Elizabethton, caught in a narrow section of trail where Gibson Brothers had positioned themselves on both sides. Systematic fire that killed 5 marshals, including Crawford, before survivors could retreat. Crawford's death eliminated operational leadership. Surviving marshals withdrawn to Elizabeth and without coordination or clear authority about whether to continue manhunt or abandon operations that had cost 16 federal officers their lives in 3 weeks. Justice Department ordered withdrawal March 25th, concluded that continuing to pursue Gibson Brothers would cost additional marshals without realistic prospect of capture given terrain and population support that made enforcement impossible without military occupation. That department wasn't authorized to deploy. Federal warrants remained active, but no resources were devoted to active pursuit. Effective acknowledgement that Gibson Brothers had successfully resisted federal authority through systematic violence that had made enforcement costs exceed any benefits from prosecuting family that had been defending themselves against botched raid based on false intelligence. The Gibson Brothers remained in Carter County, operated openly throughout surrounding territory, understood that federal government had effectively ceded jurisdiction over area where they'd successfully demonstrated willingness to kill sufficient marshals that continued enforcement became impractical. Local residents viewed them as heroes who'd defended mountain sovereignty against federal overreach, that their father's murder and mother's injury had justified response that had eliminated 16 federal agents and forced Justice Department to withdraw from territory their family had occupied for 95 years. Martha Gibson lived until 1903, died at age 65, never fully recovering from head injuries suffered during raid. Surrounded by sons and grandchildren who'd survived federal government's attempt to prosecute them for defending their homestead. Samuel Jr. died in 1927 at age 72, had spent 40 years as respected community member whose resistance to federal authority had become legendary throughout East Tennessee. His younger brothers lived similarly long lives, died peacefully in territory federal government had acknowledged it couldn't control through enforcement that required killing mountain families defending themselves against false accusations and illegal raids. The legacy persists in debates about federal authority versus local sovereignty, about what happens when law enforcement operations based on false intelligence kill innocent people, about whether systematic violence against federal officers can be justified when those officers initiated illegal violence against families defending their homes. The Gibson case demonstrated that federal power has limits when populations refuse cooperation and when geography favors defenders who know terrain, that badges don't protect agents when communities view them as aggressors rather than legitimate authorities, that sometimes resistance succeeds through violence that makes enforcement costs exceed political will to continue operations regardless of official authority supporting them. The immediate aftermath of the Gibson Brothers' victory over federal marshals created an unprecedented situation where Justice Department faced explaining how botched raid based on false intelligence had resulted in deaths of 17 innocent civilians and 16 federal officers without single arrest or prosecution. Attorney General Augustus Garland confronted impossible choice in April 1887. Acknowledged the department's catastrophic failures by admitting Crawford's raid had been illegal and withdrawing all charges against Gibson Brothers, or maintain federal authority by continuing pursuit despite clear evidence that enforcement was impossible and that public opinion throughout Tennessee had turned decisively against government whose agents had killed innocent farmer, defending his wife from armed intruders. Garland's decision would reveal whether federal government could learn from mistakes or whether institutional pride required continuing failed policies regardless of costs. Congressional investigations began in May 1887. Representatives from Tennessee demanding explanations for why federal marshals had raided innocent families' homestead, why a raid had been authorized based solely on single informant's uncorroborated allegations, why Justice Department had escalated enforcement after discovering no evidence supported original accusations. The hearings revealed systemic failures in Marshal Service's intelligence gathering and authorization procedures, documented that Crawford had requested permission for raid by submitting affidavit from Jacob Morrison without independent verification, that Justice Department supervisors had approved operation without questioning why isolated mountain family would harbor professional bank robbers with whom they had no known connections. Congressional testimony from surviving marshals contradicted official reports, several officers acknowledging privately that raid had been obvious mistake from beginning, that Crawford had ignored warnings that Gibson family was respected in community and unlikely to be protecting outlaws. Most damaging revelation came when Representative James Phelan from Tennessee obtained Morrison's financial records showing he'd been negotiating to purchase disputed land from Gibson family at below market prices, that his informant allegations had been motivated by commercial interests rather than genuine knowledge of criminal activity. Morrison had hoped federal raid would result in Gibson Brothers' arrest or death, would leave elderly Martha Gibson unable to defend family property, would create opportunity to acquire land through forced sale or adverse possession. The scheme's exposure transformed public perception. Gibson Brothers, who'd been portrayed as cop killers, became sympathetic figures defending family against corrupt informant who'd manipulated federal law enforcement to advance his personal financial interests. Attorney General Garland faced impossible political situation by June 1887, unable to continue prosecuting family whose innocence had been established by congressional investigation, unwilling to acknowledge departmental failures that had resulted in 16 marshals' deaths. His compromise was bureaucratic masterpiece avoiding accountability while quietly ending enforcement. Charges against Gibson Brothers would remain technically active, but resources wouldn't be devoted to pursuit. Warrants would stay in system, but no operations would be conducted. Official position would maintain that fugitives were simply too dangerous to pursue in hostile territory, rather than admitting government had killed innocent man and then compounded error by continuing illegal enforcement that had cost 16 federal officers their lives. The compromise satisfied no one. Families of dead marshals demanded continued prosecution, insisted their husbands and fathers had died serving their country and deserved justice that abandoning Gibson pursuit would deny them. Tennessee politicians demanded complete exoneration and official apology acknowledging federal government's wrongdoing. Gibson family wanted formal acknowledgement of Samuel Sr.'s innocence and Martha's unjust injury, compensation for damages suffered during illegal raid, prosecution of Jacob Morrison for filing false allegations that had triggered violence, killing 17 people. Garland refused all demands, maintained ambiguous position that protected Justice Department from accountability while quietly acknowledging enforcement had failed. But Garland's compromise couldn't protect Morrison, whose role in initiating tragedy had been thoroughly documented by congressional investigation. Tennessee state authorities arrested him in July 1887 on charges of filing false criminal accusations, conspiracy to deprive Gibson family of property rights, and accessory to Samuel Gibson Sr.'s murder by providing false intelligence that had motivated Crawford's illegal raid. Morrison's trial in September 1887 became proxy for broader questions about federal accountability. Prosecution's opportunity to assign blame to individual whose lies had initiated cascade of violence while avoiding direct condemnation of Justice Department that had acted on uncorroborated allegations without independent verification. Morrison was convicted on all counts, October 1887, sentenced to 15 years in Tennessee State Prison, harshest penalty ever imposed for false criminal accusations under state law. Judge's sentencing statement explicitly connected Morrison's lies to 17 deaths that had resulted from federal raid he'd initiated through fraudulent allegations, characterized his commercial motivations as aggravating factor demonstrating callous disregard for human life in pursuit of financial gain. The conviction provided limited justice for Gibson family, acknowledged that their father's death and mother's injury had resulted from deliberate fraud, but didn't address Justice Department's failures or compensate families of 16 marshals who died enforcing warrants based on false intelligence their supervisors hadn't properly verified. The Gibson brothers remained in Carter County throughout these developments, operating openly despite technically being federal fugitives, protected by community support and Justice Department's quiet decision that continued pursuit wasn't worth additional lives or political damage. Samuel Jr. had become local legend by fall 1887, man who'd defended family homestead against illegal federal raid and then hunted down marshals who'd killed his father, whose systematic elimination of 16 federal officers had forced mighty United States government to acknowledge limits of its authority when populations refused cooperation. Younger brothers benefited from his reputation, found that association with Gibson name opened doors throughout East Tennessee, where resistance to federal authority remained strong 22 years after Confederate defeat. But Samuel Jr. understood that legendary status brought dangers, that federal authorities might resume enforcement if family appeared to be celebrating victory or encouraging others to resist federal authority through violence. He maintained low profile through late 1887, avoided public statements about manhunt or his role in eliminating 16 marshals, discouraged community efforts to commemorate families' resistance through festivals or monuments that might provoke federal response. His caution was pragmatic recognition that Justice Department's decision to quietly abandon prosecution was political compromise rather than principled acknowledgement of wrongdoing. That circumstances could change if new administration decided symbolic prosecution was worth risks that Garland had deemed unacceptable. Martha Gibson's recovery progressed slowly through 1887. Head injury suffered during illegal raid, having caused permanent damage affecting her balance, vision, and memory. She was 50 years old, had expected to spend remaining decades with husband Samuel Sr. working homestead they'd built together. Instead was widow whose injury meant she could never again live independently. Her sons took turns caring for her, understood that their systematic elimination of 16 marshals had been motivated partly by desire to avenge mother's injury along with father's murder, that protecting her remaining years was obligation their violence had been calculated to defend. Martha never publicly discussed raid or manhunt, maintained dignified silence about trauma she'd suffered, became symbol throughout Tennessee of innocent mountain woman injured by federal agents whose illegal violence had triggered justified response from sons defending family honor. The families of 16 dead marshals had no such community support, had instead watched their husbands and fathers' killers become celebrated heroes while Justice Department quietly abandoned prosecution. The widows and children faced economic devastation. Federal Marshal Service providing minimal death benefits that didn't approach replacing breadwinners' lost income. forcing families to relocate or accept charity, while Gibson Brothers operated openly in territory where their father's murderers had died. Several widows petitioned Justice Department demanding continued prosecution and compensation for losses they'd suffered, received bureaucratic responses acknowledging their sacrifice while explaining that operational considerations prevented active pursuit of fugitives in hostile territory. Most persistent was Elizabeth Crawford, widow of Marshal Thomas Crawford, who'd led fatal raid and had been killed during final ambush March 22nd. Elizabeth had 3 children under age 12, had been left with minimal savings and no income prospects, had watched her husband become villain in congressional investigation revealing he'd authorized illegal raid based on unverified allegations. She wrote letters to Attorney General Garland throughout 1,888 demanding prosecution of Gibson Brothers and investigation into why her husband had been assigned to operation that congressional testimony had revealed was obviously flawed from inception. Her letters went unanswered, Justice Department maintaining position that discussing ongoing investigations was inappropriate, even though everyone understood no investigation was actually occurring. Elizabeth's campaign gained unexpected support in 1889 when journalists named Marcus Webb published Investigation in Harper's Weekly documenting how Justice Department's failures had resulted in tragedy affecting both Gibson family and Marshall families. Webb had interviewed surviving Marshals who described how Crawford had rushed into operation without proper intelligence gathering, had ignored warnings that Gibson family was respected in community and unlikely to harbor outlaws, had conducted raid with excessive force that had escalated minor confrontation into deadly violence. But Webb also documented how Gibson Brothers' systematic elimination of 16 federal officers had gone beyond defensive violence into calculated terrorism, that hunting down Marshals across 3-week period represented premeditated revenge rather than immediate self-defense responding to illegal raid. Webb's article, Complicated Narrative that had emerged from congressional investigation, suggested that both sides bore responsibility for tragedy rather than placing all blame on Morrison's false allegations and Crawford's failures. The article generated controversy throughout Tennessee. Communities that had supported Gibson Brothers' resistance, now confronting details about how systematically they'd hunted federal officers, how several Marshals killed in ambushes had opposed Crawford's tactics, and had participated reluctantly in operations they believed were misguided. Webb interviewed families of Marshals who'd privately complained to Justice Department about Crawford's aggressive enforcement but had been killed anyway by Gibson Brothers who hadn't discriminated between those responsible for raid and those simply following orders. Samuel Jr. responded to Webb's article through letter published in Knoxville Chronicle, defending families' actions as necessary to end federal persecution and demonstrate that killing innocent mountain man would cost government more Marshals than they were willing to sacrifice. He acknowledged systematic nature of violence, but maintained it had been defensive response to Justice Department's decision to escalate enforcement rather than acknowledge Crawford's mistakes, that continuing to hunt Marshals had been necessary because federal authorities wouldn't have withdrawn otherwise. The letter was carefully worded to avoid admitting criminal liability while explaining motivations, demonstrated Samuel's understanding that federal prosecution remained theoretically possible if he appeared to be celebrating violence rather than defending family from ongoing threats. The exchange between Webb and Samuel Jr. revealed deeper truth about Gibson case. Neither a simple narrative of justified resistance nor a straightforward story of cop-killing captured complexity of events where government failures had initiated violence that then escalated beyond immediate self-defense into systematic elimination of federal agents. The ambiguity would persist through subsequent decades as historians and legal scholars debated whether Gibson Brothers' actions had been justified by circumstances or whether killing 16 marshals had represented inexcusable terrorism regardless of provocations that had triggered initial confrontation. The decade following 1887 massacre brought gradual normalization of Gibson Brothers' status within Carter County society, family's legendary resistance to federal authority becoming source of regional pride rather than continuing controversy. Samuel Jr. married in 1890 at age 35, had delayed starting family until certain that federal prosecution wouldn't resume and destroy his children's future through his arrest or death. His bride was Rebecca Morrison, daughter of prominent local family unrelated to Jacob Morrison, whose false allegations had initiated tragedy. Woman who'd known Samuel since childhood and whose family had supported Gibson's throughout manhunt and its aftermath. The marriage symbolized community's acceptance that Gibson Brothers' violence had been justified, defense of family honor, that Samuel's legendary status as man who'd forced federal government to withdraw from Carter County territory made him attractive husband despite being technically federal fugitive. William, Thomas, Robert, James, and Daniel Gibson followed similar patterns through 1,890 seconds, marrying local women, establishing farms throughout Carter County, raising families in territory where their resistance to federal authority had made them heroes rather than criminals. Only youngest brother Matthew chose different path, had been 17 during manhunt, had participated in violence that had shaped his understanding of federal authority as enemy rather than legitimate government. He moved to Oklahoma Territory in 1891, part of land rush that attracted thousands seeking fresh starts in regions where federal authority was still being established and where past conflicts with government didn't carry same stigma they bore in Tennessee, where people remembered details of events. Martha Gibson died in February 1903 at age 65, never fully recovering from head injury suffered during illegal raids 16 years earlier, surrounded by 7 sons and 23 grandchildren whose existence represented family's triumph over federal government that had tried to destroy them. Her funeral drew over 300 mourners. Community gathering to honor woman whose injury had motivated son's systematic elimination of 16 federal marshals, whose dignified suffering had symbolized mountain families' resistance to federal overreach. Several ministers delivered eulogies characterizing Martha as innocent victim whose permanent injury demonstrated dangers of unchecked federal authority, comparing her son's defense of her to righteous violence praised in Old Testament when families protected themselves against unjust attacks. Samuel Jr. delivered final eulogy describing mother's life and suffering, acknowledged publicly for first time his role in hunting 16 federal marshals, explained that every marshal he'd killed had been motivated by image of mother lying unconscious with head wound inflicted by a federal agent who'd burst into family home without cause. The admission was remarkable for its frankness, Samuel explicitly connecting his violence to specific provocation rather than abstract principles about federal authority or mountain sovereignty. He maintained he'd had no regrets about systematic elimination that had forced Justice Department to withdraw, that defending mother and avenging father's murder had been obligations that justified whatever violence had been necessary to achieve family's survival and honor. The eulogy was reported in newspapers throughout Tennessee, generated renewed debate about whether Gibson Brothers' resistance had been justified and whether federal government should resume prosecution now that Samuel had publicly acknowledged role in killing 16 marshals. Attorney General Philander Knox reviewed the case in 1903, concluded that 20-year statute of limitations for murder under federal law had expired for Samuel Jr. and older brothers, that only younger brothers Daniel and Matthew remained legally prosecutable, and that expending resources pursuing men whose actions had been motivated by a legal raid that had killed their innocent father served no public purpose. Knox's decision represented final official acknowledgement that Gibson prosecution had been abandoned. That family's systematic elimination of federal marshals had succeeded in establishing their immunity from federal authority within Carter County territory. The early 20th century brought fundamental changes to Appalachian economies and federal-local relations that gradually eroded conditions that had made Gibson Brothers' resistance possible and necessary. Timber companies began extensive logging operations throughout East Tennessee mountains, built railroad lines that opened previously isolated areas to commercial development and federal oversight. Mining companies extracted coal and other minerals, brought industrial employment that reduced mountain families' dependence on subsistence farming that had made federal revenue enforcement so threatening to traditional economies. The economic transformation meant that by 1922, mountain communities' relationship with federal government had shifted from resistance to accommodation. Populations increasingly depended on infrastructure and services that required accepting federal authority that previous generations had rejected. Samuel Gibson Jr. observed these changes from his Carter County farm where he'd lived continuously since 1887 manhunt, watched as roads and railroads and mining operations transformed isolated mountain territory into economically integrated region where federal authority was accepted rather than resisted. He was 65 years old in 1920, had spent 33 years as legendary figure whose resistance to federal marshals had made him regional hero, understood that younger generation growing up in transformed Appalachia didn't share his experiences or attitudes that had made federal authority seem like occupying force rather than legitimate government. His own grandchildren attended public schools, funded partly by federal programs, accepted benefits of government that grandfather had fought through systematic violence that had killed 16 federal officers. The generational divide became apparent in 1927 when Samuel's grandson Thomas Gibson III, age 19, announced his intention to join United States Marine Corps, seeking adventure and employment that mountain farming couldn't provide during economic prosperity that preceded Great Depression. Samuel initially opposed the decision, argued that serving federal government that had killed great-grandfather and injured great-grandmother represented betrayal of family honor and resistance that had defined Gibson's legacy. But Thomas insisted that 1,887 events were historical grievances that shouldn't prevent him from pursuing opportunities that federal military service offered. That holding grudges against government for 40-year-old injustices meant accepting permanent isolation from American society that had evolved beyond post-Civil War conflicts. Samuel eventually blessed his grandson's decision, acknowledged in private conversation that Thomas was right, that holding on to 1,887 resentments meant imprisoning younger generation in past conflicts they hadn't experienced and didn't share. He attended Thomas's departure ceremony, watched grandson board train wearing Marine uniform, understood that moment represented final end of mountain family's active resistance to federal authority that his generation had practiced through violence. Samuel Jr. died 3 months later in October 1927 at age 72. Pneumonia, taking him quickly, buried beside his father Samuel Sr. and mother Martha in family cemetery on Homestead, where federal raid in 1887 had initiated events that had defined his life and legacy. Samuel's obituary in Elizabethton Star was carefully worded tribute describing his life as farmer, father, grandfather, and community leader, while acknowledging obliquely that he'd been involved in troubles with federal authorities in 1887, without specifying he'd personally killed multiple United States Marshals during systematic manhunt. The euphemistic language reflected community's desire to honor legendary figure while avoiding explicit celebration of cop killing that contemporary readers would find troubling even if they understood historical context that had made violence seem justified to mountain families defending themselves against illegal federal raid. The obituary mentioned that federal charges had never been formally dismissed, that Samuel had technically died as fugitive despite living openly for 40 years, curious legal status that symbolized Justice Department's pragmatic decision to abandon prosecution without officially acknowledging its failures. The 6 surviving Gibson brothers lived into 1,930 seconds, and 1,940 seconds died peacefully as respected community members whose resistance to federal authority had become legendary throughout East Tennessee. William died 1,934 at age 74. Thomas 1,938 at 79. Robert 1,941 at 79. James 1,944 at 82. Only youngest brother Matthew, who'd moved to Oklahoma in 1891, died outside Tennessee, passing in 1952 at age 82, having built successful ranch and raised family that knew little about his role in 1887 manhunt that had shaped early life. None of the brothers ever formally acknowledged participating in systematic elimination of 16 federal marshals, maintained dignified silence that protected them from potential prosecution, while allowing community to celebrate their resistance through stories and legends that grew more elaborate with each retelling. The deaths of last Gibson brothers in late 1,940 seconds and early 1,950 seconds marked end of direct connection to 1,887 events, left only descendants and documentary records and oral histories to preserve story of how 7 brothers had defended family Homestead through systematic violence that had killed 16 United States Marshals and forced federal government to acknowledge limits of its authority. The Justice Department officially closed Gibson investigation in 1954, acknowledging that all persons of interest had died of natural causes and that pursuing prosecution of events 67 years old served no purpose beyond symbolic assertion of federal authority. The closure came without official acknowledgement of Crawford's failures or Morrison's false allegations, bureaucratic decision that avoided accountability while finally removing family from federal fugitive records. But closing investigation didn't resolve deeper questions about whether Gibson Brothers' resistance had been justified, whether systematic elimination of 16 federal officers could be defended regardless of provocations, whether communities should celebrate violence against federal authority or acknowledge that defending Homestead had required actions that themselves were criminal regardless of circumstances. The questions would persist through subsequent decades as historians examined documents and descendants grappled with family legacies that included both righteous resistance and systematic murder of government agents who'd left families destroyed by breadwinners' deaths in Tennessee mountains far from home. The late 20th century brought renewed academic interest in Gibson cases. Scholars examined post-Civil War federal enforcement and its failures throughout American South. Historian Sarah Mitchell published a comprehensive study in 1983 titled The Gibson Manhunt: Federal Authority and Mountain Resistance in Post-Reconstruction Tennessee, documenting how Justice Department's failures had triggered violence while also acknowledging that Gibson Brothers' systematic hunting of 16 marshals represented calculated terrorism rather than immediate self-defense. Mitchell's research included interviews with descendants of both Gibson family and dead marshals, presented competing perspectives on events that had shaped families across 3 generations since 1887. Most significant revelation came from Justice Department files Mitchell obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests, documents showing that Attorney General Garland had received warnings from Tennessee politicians before Crawford's raid that Morrison's allegations were likely motivated by land dispute, that independent investigation should verify claims before authorizing operation. Garland had forwarded warnings to Marshal Service supervisors with notes suggesting caution. But supervisors had approved Crawford's raid anyway, apparently believing that mountain families wouldn't resist federal authority regardless of whether harboring allegations were accurate. The documents revealed that multiple officials had recognized potential for disaster but had approved operation anyway. Systemic failure that suggested Gibson tragedy was an isolated incident but example of broader patterns in how federal law enforcement had operated throughout Reconstruction-era South. Mitchell's book also documented economic devastation suffered by families of 16 dead marshals, detailed how widows and children had struggled financially for decades while Gibson Brothers had prospered as celebrated community members. She interviewed elderly descendants who remembered grandmothers describing poverty and social isolation they'd endured while their husbands' killers lived openly as heroes, how federal death benefits had been inadequate to replace breadwinners' incomes, how Justice Department had provided no additional support beyond minimal payments that had ceased when widows remarried or children reached 18. The account's complicated narrative of Gibson Brothers as purely righteous defenders demonstrated that their resistance had inflicted permanent damage on families of federal officers who'd left behind widows and orphans struggling to survive. The book's publication triggered debate about how Gibson legacy should be remembered, whether celebrating resistance meant dismissing suffering of marshals' families, whether acknowledging complexity meant excusing systematic violence that had killed 16 federal officers. Some descendants of Gibson Brothers objected to Mitchell's characterization of their ancestors as terrorists, maintained that systematic elimination had been necessary to force federal withdrawal and protect family from continued persecution. Descendants of dead marshals appreciated Mitchell's attention to their family's suffering, but argued that book didn't adequately condemn Gibson violence or acknowledge that federal officers had been following orders even if those orders were based on flawed intelligence. The controversy intensified in 1987 during centennial commemorations of manhunt, when Carter County Historical Society proposed marker at Gibson Homestead site, describing events while acknowledging complexity rather than celebrating resistance. Proposed text described how false allegations had triggered illegal raid killing Samuel Gibson Sr., how his sons had hunted 16 federal marshals in retaliation, how Justice Department had withdrawn rather than accept additional casualties. The neutral language satisfied no one. Gibson descendants wanting celebration of family's resistance, Marshals descendants opposing any commemoration that might appear to honor cop killing, historians arguing that honest presentation required acknowledging both federal failures and Gibson terrorism without simplistic judgments about justification. The marker was never installed. Controversy demonstrating that century after events, Fundamental disagreements persisted about whether Gibson resistance had been justified and whether systematic violence against federal officers could be commemorated without appearing to celebrate actions that had destroyed families of 16 Marshals. The failed commemoration reflected broader social divisions about how historical violence should be evaluated, whether context that made actions understandable to contemporaries justified celebrating them for posterity, whether honest acknowledgement of complexity required maintaining moral ambiguity that some found intellectually honest and others viewed as moral cowardice, refusing to condemn obvious wrongs. The 21st century brought final chapter in Gibson's story when documentary filmmaker James Patterson, ironically sharing surname with Crawford, who'd led Fatal Raid, produced comprehensive film examining events from multiple perspectives. The Gibson Manhunt, Justice and Violence in Post-Civil War Appalachia, premiered in 2015, featured interviews with historians including Sarah Mitchell, with Gibson descendants defending families' resistance, with descendants of dead Marshals describing suffering their families had endured. The documentary presented most balanced account possible, given competing narratives, acknowledged federal failures while not excusing systematic elimination of 16 federal officers, gave voice to victims' families whose perspectives had been largely ignored during centuries of scholarship focusing primarily on Gibson Brothers' resistance and its regional significance. Most powerful segment featured joint interview with Michael Gibson, great-great-grandson of Samuel Jr., and Elizabeth Harrison, great-great-granddaughter of Marshal William Harrison, killed in ambush March 16, 1887. Michael defended family's actions as necessary response to illegal raid that had killed innocent grandfather, maintained that systematic elimination of Marshals had been only way to force federal withdrawal and protect surviving family members. Elizabeth described how great-great-grandfather's death had destroyed family economically, how his widow had struggled to raise 4 children in poverty while Gibson Brothers prospered as regional heroes, how her family had never received acknowledgement that William had died serving his country, even if orders he'd been following were based on false intelligence. The exchange was civil but revealed unbridgeable gap between competing perspectives. Michael, unable to acknowledge that family's resistance had inflicted permanent harm on innocent families, Elizabeth, unable to accept that federal government's failures had created a situation where Gibson violence seemed justified to mountain families defending homesteads against illegal raids. The documentary's director, Patterson, explained in commentary that he'd hoped interview would demonstrate possibility of reconciliation across generations, but instead it had revealed that some historical wounds remained too deep for healing, that descendants still bore resentments and defended positions their ancestors had established through violence and suffering that couldn't be undone or adequately compensated across 13 decades since 1887 events. The documentary's most controversial revelation came from Justice Department files Patterson had obtained through additional FOIA requests, showing that Attorney General Garland had considered posthumously charging Samuel Gibson Sr. with federal crimes to provide justification for Crawford's raid, that prosecutors had drafted charges alleging Gibson Homestead had been used for illegal activities despite zero evidence supporting claims. The charges were never filed after congressional investigation exposed Morrison's false allegations, but documents revealed how close Justice Department had come to compounding tragedy by prosecuting dead victim to defend failed enforcement operation. The revelation generated outrage even among those who'd criticized Gibson Brothers' violence, demonstrated that federal authorities had been willing to fabricate charges rather than acknowledge institutional failures that had resulted in 17 deaths. But documents also revealed something unexpected about Samuel Jr.'s role in systematic elimination campaign. Several marshals killed during manhunt had been attempting to surrender or withdraw from operations when Gibson Brothers ambushed them, that at least 3 officers had been actively opposed to continuing pursuit and had been returning to Elizabethton when killed. The information-complicated narrative of purely defensive violence suggested that Gibson Brothers hadn't limited themselves to killing marshals who were actively threatening family, but had instead targeted any federal officer involved in operation regardless of their individual culpability or their attempts to withdraw from enforcement they'd come to believe was unjust. The revelation sparked debate among Gibson descendants, some acknowledging that killing marshals who were surrendering exceeded legitimate self-defense, others maintaining that federal officers' individual intentions were irrelevant because Justice Department's institutional decision to continue prosecution meant all marshals remained threats regardless of personal opinions about operation. Michael Gibson defended great-great-grandfather's decisions in media interviews following documentary, argued that marshals attempting to withdraw hadn't formally announced intention to Justice Department, that Gibson Brothers had no way to know whether apparent withdrawals were genuine or tactical repositioning for renewed attacks. But Michael's cousin, Rebecca Gibson, history professor at University of Tennessee, published response essay titled, "We Must Acknowledge Complexity." A Gibson descendant confronts family legacy, challenging family's traditional narrative. Rebecca argued that systematic elimination of 16 federal officers had gone beyond defensive violence into revenge, terrorism that couldn't be justified regardless of provocations, that killing marshals who were withdrawing from operations was murder by any reasonable definition, that celebrating families' resistance required ignoring suffering inflicted on innocent families whose breadwinners had died following orders based on intelligence their supervisors had failed to verify. Her essay created controversy within Gibson family, older members viewing her as traitor, undermining family honor, younger generations supporting her courage in confronting uncomfortable truths about ancestors' actions. The family division reflected broader generational shift in how violence against government authority was evaluated, younger descendants more willing to acknowledge moral complexity while older members maintained traditional narrative of justified resistance. The shift was partly due to education and changed social context, younger Gibsons having grown up with opportunities their ancestors couldn't have imagined, benefits of federal programs and infrastructure that made celebrating anti-government violence seem hypocritical when they were depending on government services their great-great-grandfathers had resisted through systematic murder of federal officers. The tension within Gibson family reached crisis in 2018 when Carter County Historical Society renewed proposal for historical marker at Gibson Homestead site, this time with more explicitly critical language acknowledging that systematic elimination of 16 marshals represented terrorism regardless of provocations that had triggered violence. Proposed text describes Samuel Sr.'s death as unjust killing resulting from illegal raid, but also characterized subsequent manhunt as premeditated revenge that had inflicted permanent harm on families of federal officers who'd left behind widows and orphans. The language was carefully balanced, acknowledged federal failures without excusing Gibson violence, gave equal weight to suffering on both sides rather than celebrating resistance or condemning cop killing. Michael Gibson opposed the marker, argued that critical language dishonored families' legitimate defense of Homestead, that acknowledging Gibson Brothers had committed terrorism would validate federal government's position despite documentary evidence proving raid had been illegal and unjustified. Rebecca Gibson supported the marker, maintained that honest presentation required acknowledging complexity, even if that meant confronting uncomfortable truths about family violence. Her support brought threats from distant relatives who viewed her position as betrayal, required security presence at her university office after anonymous messages suggested she was endangering family honor through public criticism of ancestors' actions. The marker was approved in 2019 over Gibson family objections, installed at Homestead site with dedication ceremony that deliberately included both Gibson descendants and representatives of Marshall families. The ceremony was tense, Michael boycotting while Rebecca spoke, acknowledging complexity of legacy, Elizabeth Harrison representing Marshall families by reading names of 16 officers who died during manhunt. The event received national media coverage, presented as example of community attempting to confront difficult history while acknowledging that complete reconciliation might be impossible when competing narratives reflected genuinely different experiences and perspectives that couldn't be fully reconciled without someone accepting version of events that dishonored their ancestors. By 2024, Gibson Homestead had become minor tourist destination, marker attracting visitors interested in post-Civil War, federal enforcement and mountain resistance. Site where guides presented balanced narrative acknowledging both federal failures and Gibson violence without simplistic judgments about justification. The tourism generated modest revenue for Carter County while keeping memory alive of events that had defined relationships between mountain communities and federal authority for generations. But tourism also trivialized tragedy, reduced complex history of 17 deaths and permanent injuries into attraction where visitors posed for photographs beside marker describing systematic murder of federal officers by family defending Homestead against illegal raid. The historical marker's final paragraph captured unresolvable complexity. The Gibson-Marshall conflict of 1887 exemplifies the challenges of evaluating historical violence, where government failures provoke systematic resistance that itself inflicted unjust harm. Neither simple condemnation nor celebration adequately addresses the tragedy of 17 deaths resulting from false allegations, illegal enforcement, and retaliatory violence. Visitors should reflect on how failures of law enforcement accountability can trigger responses that themselves violate justice, creating cycles of violence where all participants bear responsibility for outcomes that destroyed innocent lives on all sides. If this complete expanded story made you grapple with irreducible complexity of Gibson legacy, the federal failures that killed innocent father, the systematic violence that eliminated 16 marshals, including some attempting to withdraw, the families on both sides destroyed by events neither fully controlled, the generational divisions about how resistance should be remembered, the impossible questions about when defensive violence becomes terrorism, regardless of provocations. Leave your like and share. Subscribe for stories that refuse simple moral judgments, that force examination of how government failures and violent resistance both destroy innocent lives, that acknowledge celebrating heroic resistance requires dismissing suffering of those killed during that resistance, that demonstrate historical truth often resists neat narratives where heroes and villains can be easily identified. Comment about whether Gibson Brothers' systematic elimination of 16 marshals was justified defense of Homestead or terrorism regardless of illegal raid that triggered violence, whether Rebecca Gibson's willingness to criticize family legacy represents courage or betrayal, whether historical markers' balanced language appropriately addresses complexity or represents moral cowardice, refusing to condemn obvious wrongs, whether celebrating resistance to government overreach requires ignoring that resistance destroyed innocent families whose breadwinners died following flawed orders. Because these questions persist wherever historical violence must be evaluated across generations, wherever government failures provoke responses that themselves inflict unjust harm, wherever families divided by events they didn't experience must decide whether maintaining traditional narratives honors ancestors or imprisons descendants in conflicts they didn't choose, wherever tourism and commemoration risk trivializing tragedies that destroyed real lives in pursuit of causes that seemed righteous to perpetrators but imposed permanent costs on victims. Until next time, remember that Gibson Brothers killed 16 United States Marshals after federal raid based on false allegations killed their innocent father, that some Marshals they hunted were attempting to withdraw from operations they'd come to believe were unjust, that families on both sides suffered permanent damage from violence neither fully controlled. That honest evaluation requires acknowledging federal accountability for initiating tragedy while not excusing systematic hunting of officers that went beyond immediate self-defense into revenge that itself violated justice, and that ultimately Gibson's story demonstrates that when government failures provoke violent resistance, innocents on all sides pay prices that can never be fully justified or adequately compensated, regardless of who bears greater responsibility for initiating cycles of violence that destroy lives across generations.